Good afternoon, everyone. Today we will continue with our NPTEL MOOC course titled Tribal Studies in India, Interdisciplinary Perspectives and Approaches. We have come quite far in this course, and I think we have studied quite extensively about tribal communities in India. And in the last 20 lectures, you have seen and understood the different ways in which tribal communities have been studied, the different approaches that one can utilize when trying to study tribal communities. And also we have done an extensive engagement with the issues of colonialism, the issue related to the categories, the different categories in which communities are understood, particularly tribal communities such as the significance of scheduled tribes, ST, and also other categories like PVTGs, criminal tribes, so on and so forth. And we have also looked at the experience of colonialism, the encounter between the colonial state and tribal communities, and the way in which colonial rule impact tribal societies. Now today we will move ahead of the topics that we have already studied. This lecture will specifically focus on tribes and the Indian national movement. Now many a times the assumption is that tribal communities, given that they are already living in a very geographically isolated places, and the colonial rule, the colonial state or the British has also further reinforced that geographical isolation by implementing laws and regulations that administratively put tribal communities as isolated communities, or in short we can call it administrative isolation, that prevent or that does not allow tribal communities to participate or actively contribute to the wider political processes that were happening during the colonial rule, particularly the anti-colonial movements or the Indian national movement. So many a times we are accustomed to thinking that tribal communities have no role or even minimal role when it comes to the Indian national movement. But then through these lectures and through some case studies, we will in some sense debunk this myth by showing that tribal communities were actually in fact very active when it comes to the Indian national movement. And at the same time, this is not to say that all tribal communities in India, the 705 tribal communities who are recognized as scheduled tribes in India, equally participated, equally contributed significantly. The contribution of all these communities varies from one community to the other community. The contribution and participation, the role of its communities, the way in which they contributed, the way in which they participated also significantly varies from region to region. But at the same time, the point being that it is wrong to say that tribal communities have no role in the Indian national movement. And if several communities were unable to actively participate in it, then there must be a reason why they were unable to do so. So through this lecture, we will try to really look at these issues and bring out the way in which tribal communities contributed or participated in the Indian national movement. Now before going to the Indian national movement, we will try to have a very basic conceptual understanding of what is a national identity. Now national identity in simple words can be defined as a feeling of consciousness and loyalty towards one community as ethnos. Now in some of the few classes we have already talked about the significance of categories like ethnicity. When one talks about ethnicity, what are we essentially talking about? We are talking about a shared idea of belonging. Now in the case of national identity also, we are also talking about a shared feeling of consciousness, in a sense that all of us have this conscious notion and idea that we belong to a one singular national community. That is, in the case of us, we are all Indians, right? Now likewise in India particularly, this is very significant, because if you look at all the states in India, we come from we come from different regions, we have different identities, language, culture, religion, so on and so forth. But then all of us embrace this singular, there is this singular feeling of consciousness that all of us belong to one single national community, that is, we all identify as an Indian. Now given India's enormous diversity, the conception of national identity also poses a serious challenge to the idea of a coherent Indian national identity. Now this is not to say that there is no challenge, to the idea of, a national identity. Everywhere, all over the world, if you look at it, there are always, contestations related to, identity. Likewise, in India also, there are several contestations. Sometimes there are several tensions as well when it comes to, conceptualizing a very coherent Indian national identity. Now, like I said, India is a very, very diverse country, divided into various regions and sub-regions, and the people in sub-regions are further divided into hundreds or thousands of castes and sub-castes. And most of the time, the people who fall outside these dominant linguistic regional societies, and probably who are mostly, non-caste societies, are the one who are described or who are referred to as tribes. Now, this understanding is very important, is very dominant when it comes to tribes, that they are outside of the mainstream society. But then in the last few lectures that we have already talked about, yes, many tribal communities, are not strongly influenced by the dominant, or they have not integrated themselves into the mainstream society. But then at the same time, in some cases, like in Madhya Pradesh or Jharkhand or many other states, we also see that many tribal communities are also gradually undergoing some kind of transformation, whereas some communities may move towards influenced by a more mainstream society, like adopting moving towards a caste like society. Or in some case, it will be like that, they are coming back, to their roots, in a sense that there is a kind of ethnic revivalism that is happening, right. So, these things, are something, there is a continual interplay of, tribal communities moving towards, different directions, right. Now, all of us know that, in India, when we talk about, the Indian national movement, it originated out of the India struggle for freedom from the British rule. In the course of this struggle, nationalism in India developed two sides. One entailed the assertion and articulation of nationalism against the British, and the other was India's own linguistic and cultural identity. Now, at the dawn of India's independence, integrating this entity into a one single geographical unit was very, very challenging. For instance, we have 562 princely states, right, and beyond the princely state also are these several tribal regions which were put under partially excluded and excluded areas. So, the task before Indian nationalist leadership was that how to bring all these regions, how to bring all these people together. Now, it was not that the 552 princely states, among these 562 princely states as well, there are several tribal princely states. For example, Tripura, Bastar, Chotanagpur. So, you will see that in these places there are also communities belonging to the tribes who actually were having their own princely state. In the northeast, Tripura is a very, very classic example. The role, contribution and participation of tribal communities in India have significantly contributed to the making of Indian national identity and Indian nationalism. Now, in the succeeding slides, we will really try to understand how tribals have communicated, how tribals have participated or contributed. Now, there is no doubt that colonialism brought about a significant change in Indian society, and the change was not in a very particular domain. So, it affected, or it has significant impact in the economic, in the political, in the social, in the cultural, and the way in which communities have experienced and responded to that kind of change was also not entirely the same, in the sense that it was not that every communities experience similar kind of impact. Now, before British rule, tribes live autonomously, separate from the larger Indian society, in a sense that they live in geographical isolation from the mainstream Indian society. This is not to say that every tribal communities refuse to be in touch with the larger Indian society, or they don't want to be in touch with any non-tribal population. That is not the point. The point being that many tribal communities have lived in areas at sometimes which are geographically quite isolated, with rugged terrains, difficult to access. But at the same time, you will also see that there are many tribal communities who live in close proximity with any other society or any other community. Now, the colonial administrator integrated them into a unified political and economic system, subjecting them to common laws. This led to the erosion of their control over land, forest and water, driven by both the British and non-tribal elites. Now, an important part of the colonial rule was that it created this unified political and economic system. And over a period of time, for the tribes, the British rule was not only a political subjugation of Indians. The British rule was also an economic subjugation, and this economic subjugation requires one part of the economic subjugation was that definitely there was a lot of deindustrialization. Indian farmers, were compelled, to, cultivate, crops which to supply the raw materials such as cotton in the UK. But when it comes to the tribes, the economic subjugation was primarily, or most intensely felt in terms of loss of access to resources, whether it is forest resources, land resources and water resources. Now, many tribal communities, if you look at, the regions inhabited by tribal communities, you will see that, these are also very, very resource rich regions, right, very, very forested, or, very, very, where tribal communities have vast amount of lands, for instance. Now, with the coming of the British, what happened is that there is commodification of these resources, and in the process, tribal communities were being dispossessed, from their lands, from or prevented, from accessing, forest resources, right. So, one of the significant impact economic, particularly when one talks about, colonialism for the tribes, is the economic subjugation of tribal communities. Now, many a times, since the British were also, ruling and governing India through Indians themselves. Now, what we see is that, tribes face two kinds of colonial ruling, colonialism. One was colonialism by the British, and many times tribes also face, a colonial-like situation from the non-tribal population. So, prior to India's freedom struggle, tribes fought colonial rule to defend their autonomy, yet they remain largely absent from official histories, and their role in the national movement was minimal. Tribal isolation limited national outreach, while exploitation by non-tribals further hindered their participation. Participation of tribal communities was limited to certain pockets. Some of these were the case in 1772 when the Mal Pahariyas of Bihar revolt, in 1888 when the Gonds of the Satpuras took arms under the leadership of Appa Sahib in 1813, and so on. Now, the British rule in India does not happen at one go, right. So, first, they occupy certain regions, they, and they gradually expanded to different territories and different regions, subjugating, the different princely states in India. That is one example. Now, when it comes to the tribes also, the story was the same, in a sense that all the tribes, were made part of their territories and regions which they inhabited were annexed gradually, which took probably, more than 100 to 150 years, by the British to entirely subjugate all the tribal communities in India. Now, what we see is that during this period, there were a lot of resistance movements, against the incursion of the colonial state into tribal territories. Now, many a times, today definitely there are attempts, to revive, these, personalities, particularly coming from the tribal communities, who have, resisted the expansion of the colonial state. Now, very, very renowned names like, Birsa Munda, which is being widely circulated today. People really started knowing that, look, tribal communities have, a long history of, resisting, the colonial rule, and today Birsa Munda is a very, very good example, how in terms of, reviving, or in terms of, educating people about the contribution of tribal communities towards, resisting the expansion of the colonial state. But the tragedy has been that, many of these, heroes, or many of these, icons and personalities were does not found, mention when one looks at, the official histories, right. So, there was, on the part of the anti-colonial movement or nationalist leadership as well, there was very little effort to really enable the participation of tribal communities. One was because of the administrative isolation that was imposed by the colonial state, in a sense that through partially excluded and excluded areas, that prevent the entry of non-tribal population into tribal areas in many parts of India. So, for the nationalist leaders also, it was not always very easy to get into tribal areas and make sure that they were also part of the larger Indian national movement. That also hindered in a big way the tribal communities to actively participate in the national movement. Now, even when tribes join anti-colonial struggles, they remain excluded from leadership and decision making. Now, another part of this is that another story is that if you look at the nationalist leadership, you will see that many very, very rarely tribal communities were getting the leadership position. So, therefore, many a times tribal leaders, even if you talk about Birsa Munda, he is like a very, very regional or local leader, right. So, he does not represent the entire nation as a whole. So, he was more of about representing his own community. It's not it. So, therefore, many tribal communities, they have participated actively in the Indian national movement, but not as a leader, or they were not necessarily made part of the important decision makers. Now, there was also another issue, that in some way hindered the participation of tribal communities was the clash of interest between the Congress leaders and the tribals, which began to be very evident from the 1930s and the 90s. So, for instance, in 1930, about 1,70,000 villagers, many of whom were Adivasis, were involved in forest satyagraha in Ahmednagar and Nasik, independent of the Congress party initiative. Now, many a times, tribal also mobilized themselves outside of the, Congress leadership, the Indian National Congress leadership. So, in many parts of India, even in Northeast India, so an example here is that Ahmednagar and Nasik. But if you look at, the larger Indian society, say Birsa Munda or, less known, figures today, you will see that, they have resisted the entry or they have resisted colonial rule, right? Any form of colonial rule in their own territories, in their own homelands, by mobilizing themselves. So, many a times you will see that there are hundreds and hundreds of stories of resistance against the expansion of the colonial state. Now, among the Santals, most of the political movements in the early 20s were largely autonomous of the Congress leadership. The Tebaga movement in Bengal, the provincial Kisan Sabha movement in South, all of this took place without the Congress support. In fact, tribals shunned all their relationship with the landlord dominated Congress. Now, many of the Congress leadership also were contributing towards the exploitation of tribal communities. So, therefore, many a times tribals refused to also there was some sense of skepticism on the leadership, on the part of the leadership of the INC. But at the same time, this is not to say that they refuse to actively support the movement. So, in their own ways, like I said, across India, they have undertaken movements, they have mobilized the people who were actively fighting or who were actively leading movements to oust the colonial state. Now, by and large, throughout the colonial rule, the British neglected the tribal welfare. However, some development occur, such as a tribal leadership, a section of tribal communities have taken the position of being a leader within the community, resisting outsider exploitation and clashing with non-tribal society, which also clash with leadership that overlook tribal concerns. So, many a times tribals have very, very specific issue, and many a times there was this strong feeling that their issues are not being taken seriously. So, in that kind of situation, it produced tensions and contestations within the larger Indian national movement or anti-colonial movement. Now, a lot of important leaders, there are a lot of important leaders among the community. So, I will just mention two important leaders. One is Jaipal Singh Munda, and definitely he is widely known tribal leader, and the other is J.J. Nichols Roy from Meghalaya. So, both were also key members of the Constituent Assembly in 1946. Now, to quickly look at Jaipal Singh Munda's, he was a very, very strong advocate for tribal rights and representation in the assembly debates. He also founded the Adivasi Mahasabha in 1930, which played a very, very important role in popularizing the term Adivasi as an identity to challenge the prejudice against forest communities. Now, Jaipal Singh Munda in the Constituent Assembly have no hesitancy to say that he belongs to a tribal, he is an Adivasi, and he was very, very instrumental in popularizing the term Adivasi. Now, if you come to the Northeast, a very important name is J.J. Nichols Roy. He was a prominent tribal leader from Assam. Now, if you look at here, I am saying that he is from Assam simply because in the 1950s all these states that we have today like Meghalaya, Mizoram, they were all part of Assam. And there were only two princely states, Meghalaya, Tripura and Manipur. So, Meghalaya was, upgraded, Meghalaya, obtained a statehood in 1972, and Mizoram obtained a statehood in 1986, and it was inaugurated in 87 along with Arunachal Pradesh. Now, until then, all of these states, were part of the greater, Assam. He was also a member of the Constituent Assembly. They were made part of the Constituent Assembly to specifically speak for the interests of tribal communities. Now, his contribution was significant in advocating for the rights of tribal communities, especially in the northeastern region of India. Nichols Roy also founded the Assam Tribal League, which worked for the political rights and welfare of the tribal population in Assam. His leadership helped in the organization, bringing attention to the issues of tribal communities in the state. Now, these two leaders, I specifically brought them here to acknowledge, their contributions when, in the drafting of the Indian Constitution, which incorporated a very, very important, element, particularly when one talks about tribes, which is the 5th schedule and the 6th schedules. Now, the 5th schedule and the 6th schedule in particular, many politicians, many political leaders and scholars, and activists who are from the Northeast actually call J.J. Nichols Roy as the architect of the 6th schedule. Now, likewise, a name which we cannot ignore when we talk about, tribal leadership and their relationship to the larger Indian national movement is Jaipal Singh Munda. So now what happened, in the post-independent India in relation to national integration, national inclusion in relation to tribes. So national integration, everywhere, particularly also in India, is always, a priority. And however, similar attention is lacking in addressing issues of socio-economic development and inclusive state policies that show respect for tribal communities. However, in the post-independence period, although many communities have gained significant underwent significant change, particularly positive change when it comes to socio-economic development, but when it comes to tribal communities, they continue to suffer extensively from different kinds of marginalization, discrimination, and like I said, in tribal, if you look at the national statistics, you will see that tribal communities continue to be at the bottom of the pyramid. Now in that kind of situation, it becomes very difficult for tribal communities to to really be at par with other communities when one looks at various indicators of development. This is not to say that there are affirmative action policies in the form of reservation are not useful, but in terms of their share and quota, the position of tribals is far from adequate, where because dominant regional groups at times also continually oppose reservation policy. And despite the presence of laws restricting the exploitation or expropriation of resources belonging to the tribal communities, what we also see is that there is a lot of dispossession that is happening. Particularly one of the important dispossession, one of the most significant dispossession that has happened among tribal communities is land alienation, or more broadly alienation from their resources. And this has happened with the coming of the colonial state, but in post-independent India also, if you look at the amount of land alienation that has happened, you will see that tribes have been continually deprived and dispossessed from different kind of resources. So just statistics, tribal communities constitute about 40% of the displaced population, although they comprise only about 8% of the total population of India. So the present the benefits of development presented as modern India's pillar did not many a times fail to benefit everyone equally, and out of that tribal communities are yet to really benefit from the development, particularly in post-independence period. So tribes contributed to the making of the nation, but their sacrifice in many cases goes unacknowledged. So to conclude, tribal autonomy over land, forest and water was curbed under colonial rule, adding a new dimension to their marginality. Like I said, the intuition of the colonial state in tribal territories follows a long history, follows what was followed by dispossession of tribal communities from land, forest and water resources. Even in post-independence period, tribes have been consistently treated poorly. Not only are their interests inadequately addressed, but they also suffer exploitation, oppression and discrimination. This acts as a hindrance to creating a national identity and further alienates tribes from it. Tribes are not just at the margins, but they are considered even outside the margins of Indian national identity. So therefore, this impoverishment and dispossession of tribes from their resources and the kind of exploitation that they continue to face even in the post-independence period have posed a lot of challenges for the communities in terms of positively contributing to the integration to development at large. So therefore, through this presentation, what we have understood is that it is not that the isolation of tribes have prevented them from participating in the national movement, but there were several factors. At some level tribes definitely contributed significantly, maybe say in central India, but at other places they may not contribute significantly. So one, it is wrong to say that tribals did not make any significant contribution to the making of to Indian national movement. Secondly, when it comes to even the constitution drafting and all, you will see that tribal leaders like Jaipal Singh Munda, Nichols Roy have participated and actively contributed, although their contribution was mostly in relation to tribes, but then in terms of the overall making of the drafting of the Indian constitution, their contributions and their role cannot be negated. So in this way, the contribution of tribals was not only limited to their community, but also resonates widely in terms of building building an inclusive Indian national identity. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you so much.